So here we are again. It's October, and every October since I've been doing YouTube, I like to try to do something themed for the month. Last year it was a month of mostly talking about Goosebumps books. This month I've decided I'm going to just try to do some general October stuff. Just general reviews of horror novels, or in this case, books I feel like fit more what I would recommend to read in October. So, that said, this is my recommendations list of books that I feel kind of have a October autumnal kind of feel to them. Books that, when you read them, you think to yourself, this definitely feels like an autumn novel, and a Halloween kind of time, if not year novel. Some novels feel like summer novels, like they have a very summery feel. Some feel like winter. Some feel like spring. These are a list of books that I feel like fit autumn, and especially the Halloween aspect of autumn. So, I know that probably sounds weird, but that's just how it feels to me. So, that said, I'm just gonna start. So, first up on my recommendations list is Clive Barker's debut novel, The Damnation Game. There it is in profile. This was his first novel. He published it in the 80s after coming off a very successful run as a short story writer with a 3-volume collection of short stories called The Books of Blood. And those are excellent horror stories as well. He got a big boost in popularity when Stephen King commented on how Clive was the future of horror. And he became a pretty big selling writer. So after the success of his run as a short story writer, he turned to writing novels with this one. And this is definitely a horror novel. It's a Faustian story about making a deal with the devil, and how making a deal with the devil will eventually come back to bite you in the ass. It's a very interesting story. There's a picture of Clive, by the way. Very young Clive. It's a very interesting story. It's because it's mostly from the point of view of an innocent bystander who gets caught up in all of this activity. He is not directly a part of this pact. He gets dragged into everything after he gets out of prison, and this really rich millionaire hires him to be his personal bodyguard. And with that job, he gets a lot more than he bargained for when he finds out the history of everything. Because the demonic entity with whom the millionaire made the deal with decades prior, named Mammalian, comes back and starts stirring up a lot of trouble. Not only for the guy who is trying to run from paying his dues, but for Marty and for other people as well. The millionaire has a daughter named Karis, and Karis is this withdrawn, kind of depressed woman, and she's a heroin addict. She's kind of tries to escape reality through a needle, and her and Marty actually form a romantic relationship. So they're trying to get through all of this stuff that her father is brought on everybody together. It's very good. It doesn't feel like a conventional horror novel. It's not your typical, werewolves, vampires, demons, etc. This isn't Bentley Little. This is unique stuff. This definitely isn't like a dime store quality horror novel. It's very good. And as usual, Clive has a very poetic and literate writing style. He describes everything very eloquently, which is a big reason I like him, as well as just for his vast imagination and the unique worlds that he creates. This one, he doesn't really do that. His debut as a novelist is more straightforward. Not to say it's any less interesting or not worth reading as some of the world-spanning fantasy novels he would later write. But it's a very straightforward Faust, retelling. But very good, and there's also a lot of other things that happen. Some really weird stuff, including Mamalian using a guy who died, and he doesn't quite realize he's dead. He's just noticing odd stuff's happening to him, like he notices this really terrible smell, and that, it's like his fingers are starting to fall off and things like that. So that's interesting. Like I said, very good debut, and definitely good seasonal Halloween read. Damnation Game, Clive Barker. So, that one out of the way, I'm going to bring up a classic. This is Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House. I did a video on this a long time ago, and the tone of the video, at least the end of it, wasn't probably as serious or reverent as it should have been. I mean, I did a legitimate review for it, but then I ended the video on a really silly note. This time I'm just going to be fully reverential in my review. So for those who didn't know, The Haunting of Hill House is, like I said, it's a classic. It was published by Shirley Jackson, who Shirley had written a bunch of short stories as well as a lot of non-fiction pieces. And she's also written some other novels, and they're all kind of like this. They're all in this really gothic kind of vein, and they're great. The premise of Horror House is that these four people have come to this old house to do a kind of study. Like this professor, his name is Dr. Montague, is doing like an examination of psychic phenomena, and these people who all kind of have displayed or at least claim to have psychic abilities come. And one of them is the main protagonist of this novel, and her name is Theodora, or hang on, Eleanor. Eleanor is the main character. Theodora is a secondary character. Eleanor is a very lonely, kind of withdrawn person. She's kind of had a rough life. She has an older sister that's kind of just bullied her into obeying everything she wants, that she lives with. She doesn't have any kind of freedom, and she feels like, a sense of inhibition. Like she is just kind of so browbeaten by her domineering older sister that she just doesn't feel any kind of freedom or any kind of joy. And so, in a moment of rebelliousness, when she finds out about this, she literally just packs up and takes off. Like, that's her moment where she's finally like, I'm gone, fuck this, here I go. So, and she does, and she goes to the examination because she herself had displayed some psychic abilities. There's a part where it talks about when she was a child, she managed to, lift telekinetically a bunch of stones and, poured them on the roof like it was raining, like rocks. And the great thing about Jackson, and especially The Haunting of Hill House, is that her writing is very psychological, especially this novel. She uses a lot of unreliable narration. She uses lots of characters that are hiding secrets, or who may not be hiding secrets. And the great thing about this is the other characters in this seem very suspicious, but this may all just be in her head. Eleanor, it's subtly hinted at that she kind of is a little unstable mentally. And this affects kind of the narrative style and the voice of the story. It's written in a third person, but in a very kind of ominous, cold third person that kind of seems to reflect Eleanor's perspective on things. It's very good. I would recommend actually anything Shirley Jackson's written for kind of this October time of year. Haunting of Hill House, several short stories including The Lottery, and she wrote another fantastic novel which I really like as well called We Have Always Lived in the Castle. That is also a great quality October read, and also even more in this psychological vein. So check out Shirley Jackson's Haunting of Hill House this October. Moving on, I have another horror novel that this is not what most people would consider a horror novel. This one I feel like is more of an existential horror novel, and it's Kurt Vonnegut's SlaughterhouseFive. anybody familiar with Vonnegut would be like, what? He didn't write horror. And I would agree. He didn't write horror in the conventional sense or in a genre sense. He didn't write horror stories. He wrote philosophical novels. However, the stuff he talked about is no less horrific. The human mind, the human heart, the absurdity and, futility of the universe, the meaninglessness of everything. To me, that is just as scary as anything in actual horror writing. For those who don't know, SlaughterhouseFive is a fantastic novel. It was published in 1969, and it's about a character named Billy Pilgrim who is caught in an endless time loop, or time flux. Like, he drops in and out of various parts of his life over and over, and he can't escape it. He's seen his death several times, he's seen his birth many times, and he's relived over and over and over and over various parts of his life. Everything from being a World War II soldier in Dresden during the firebombing, to a part where he is kidnapped by aliens and put into a human zoo on another planet with this attractive woman that he's meant to mate with. It's strange and it's great. It's very bizarre. It's everything that Vonnegut excelled at. If you haven't read Kurt Vonnegut at all, this is actually a great introduction to his work. It's the first book I read by him. He wrote very philosophic, comedic stuff about just how meaningless and absurd life is, with very odd characters with odd names, and it's very bizarre stories that take some very strange turns. And SlaughterhouseFive is great, and it's just as sad, dark, comical, and brilliant as everything else he's written. So while SlaughterhouseFive may not be a conventional horror story, or even meant to be a scary story at all, to me its ideas about how scary life is make it horror. So check it out, SlaughterhouseFive, Kurt Vonnegut. Moving on, I have an actual horror novel, and this one meant to be scary, meant to be a horror work. I've talked about it before. It's The Fisherman by John Langan. John Langan has written another novel called House Windows that I have not read, but I want to, and he's published some collections of short stories. However, The Fisherman is the first and so far only thing I have read by him, and this novel is scary. It is scary as hell. I gotta confess right now, I normally don't react much to writing. Like, I like a lot of writers, and I like lots of pieces of writing, but I usually don't have any kind of reaction to when I read something. Very few things have elicited any kind of response beyond, maybe I'll check out something. But this is the first piece of fiction I've ever read that actually made me feel creeped out. How do I even talk about this? This is a trip. This novel is a very strange, very dark, and very sad story. It's told in a very unconventional structure. It encompasses 3 major parts, and it's part historical novel, part horror story, part philosophic kind of treatise on the idea of life after death and bereavement, and part dark fantasy novel. It's very strange. It's kind of goes through all these narrative threads that all interconnect and are all kind of overseen by this kind of darkness that hangs over it. There's a kind of a gothic atmosphere to the whole thing, and it's very hard to explain concisely. If someone were to ask you what this is about, I mean, you could give them the literal definition of it's about a guy whose wife dies, he grieves by fishing, and here's a very strange story about a fisherman who's not your average fisherman. You could give that explanation, but there's a lot more to it than that. It's very strange. There's a lot of weirdness going on, but it's also brilliant. It's actually one of the best novels I've ever read, and it makes me realize how loosely people throw around words like, I loved that book, or that book is amazing, or that book is fantastic. It makes me realize just how loose we are with our words. But this is one I would literally say is one of the best novels I've ever read. And it is perfect for October. It is a perfect read for any time of the year, but especially for this time of year when everything kind of has that seasonal mist hanging over it. Everything kind of has like a gothic atmosphere. And the time of year when we celebrate and revere horror, like what better like time to read it. If you don't read any of the other books I recommend in this video, please, for the love of God, read The Fisherman by John Lankin. If you want, you can watch my other video on this channel about it. I did a kind of short 4-minute review of it. And I go into kind of some more of the plot aspects and everything in that. But just read it. It's so good. And like I said, it's a lot of different things. It's a fishing story. It's a historical novel. It's a novel about grief and loss. It's a horror story. It's a dark fantasy story. All expertly blended in. Like, Langan knows how to, like, take all these different ideas that are seemingly very disparate and couldn't work together in one story and melds them all beautifully. So, again, The Fisherman, John Langan. Please read it. Please. Next up is a lot more of a conventional horror novel. I recently just read it, I think last month, or in the beginning of this month. It's called Pen Pal by Dathan Auerbach. Pen Pal is basically a novel-length creepypasta. If that turns you off, I do not blame you. I like creepypastas myself. I do like to read them. I think they are fun. If you don't, I will understand you skipping this one. But for those who are interested, Pen Pal is actually a very well-written novel. It started off as a series of posts on Reddit that were telling kind of this horror story in installments. And they were all basically, when the story was done, collected here. Dathan used a Kickstarter backing project to get this book form out. And it's very good, and it's actually well worth the read. The writing is very good, like much better than I would expect for basically an internet forum story. And the story is actually pretty unnerving. There's parts that are genuinely creepy in some of its ideas that are going on. But to give a very general exposition of the plot, because I don't want to give anything away because it's worth reading, it's about a kid who, when he was young, he sends off a postcard. His class all write a letter explaining who they are and asking whoever finds them to be their pen pal. And then they tie them to balloons and they set them off. And some time goes by and the boy gets a response. But his response is just a photo. And then he starts getting more photos. And he starts realizing that he's in all of these photos. And they're all taken from far away when he wasn't aware of it. He then gets more encounters with this person when him and his friends set up a lemonade stand. Or, no, it's a snow cone stand. Well, I think they do a lemonade stand and then a snow cone stand. However, they charge $1. And then he gets back $1 that he sent as a kid for stamps to his pen pal. And just so on and so on. As he gets older, his interactions with this character they don't become more overt or more explicit, but they're always there. And the guy gets a little more closer and closer to how much he's willing to interact with him. And it's just creepy because it's written, it's written from the first person, and it's written as someone who's looking back and reporting all these things that had happened to him. But even so, there's still kind of this distance to it. It has a very kind of cold, clinical eye about these things that are very matter-of-factly happened. But also at the same time, I feel like he's writing about somebody else. There's kind of this dissociation between his past self and him going through all these things. That kind of adds to this layer of melancholia and creepiness. But yeah, definitely check out Pen Pal. It's very good. And I usually don't take chances on writers I've never heard of, but the title and the premise alone hooked me, and it did not disappoint. So it's a very good literary review. Next up, I have another novel by my favorite writer, who he's not considered a horror writer. However, I think most things that he's written have elements of horror. However, that said, I still think this particular novel fits this October recommendations. So I have here Kafka on the Shore by Haruki Murakami. So those not familiar with Murakami, quick little side note, he's my favorite writer. He's a Japanese writer who's written several novels and short stories. He's also written some nonfiction. And most of his stuff has a very kind of surrealist quality. It feels very dreamlike. He typically writes novels about unnamed characters, usually in their mid-30s, who have very kind of mundane, humdrum personalities. They're usually, I mean, sometimes they're single, sometimes they're in relationships, but typically he just writes very passive male characters that just kind of go with the flow and find themselves inadvertently wandering into these strange situations and through their interactions with people they meet. This one's a little different. It's a very strange metaphysical story. It's basically two narratives happening at once. One is about a boy who runs away from home. He's had a very kind of bad home life. He's the son of an artist who's like very obsessed with his work, and the artist has continually told him his whole life that there's a curse on him. And this curse is an Oedipal one, wherein he will kill his father and sleep with his mother. And he also says he will sleep with his sister too. Well, the boy doesn't have a mother or a sister. He just lives with his father. And he leaves home and he goes on a trip to the city. Like, he's trying to escape. He's running away. And he has a companion that drifts in and out of the story that only he can see, who's referred to as the boy named Crow. And only he can talk to the boy named Crow because he can only see him. It's heavily hinted at that the boy named Crow is just kind of an imaginary friend or like a hallucinatory aspect of his personality, even though it doesn't expressly say that. The boy named Crow kind of encourages him to do things and makes him step out. The second narrative is an old man who helps find cats because he can talk to them. Because when he was a kid, he like passed out through this strange event in his class and woke up with the ability to speak to him. And they never like physically meet or converge, but these two narrative threads are metaphysically connected. There's other stuff going on too, but that's the gist of it. But it's very strange. Probably the weirdest, or one of the weirdest books Murakami's written. And it's amazing. It's powerful, it's dark, it's strange, and very funny. He has a very dry, very comedic sense of humor. So Kafka on the Shore, please read that, because it's, again, worth reading. Next up I have Salem's Lot. Salem's Lot, classic vampire story. Shows King at his best. One of my favorite King novels. And I usually don't like vampire fiction, but King makes it work. He's brilliant. So check out Salem's Lot. If you like small town stories with like a layer of undulating darkness under it, this is the one to go with. I mean, everyone knows the plot, everyone knows the story, but if you haven't read King, this is a good one to start with. And like I said, if you like small town stories where dark shit is going on under the surface, this will definitely be your thing. So, I may do a full video on that later. Perhaps. Next up, we have another horror novel, although one most people don't think of as horror. We have Coraline by Neil Gaiman. Coraline is a dark fairy tale about a girl who finds another reality behind a door with other parents with button eyes. They basically want to take her soul and button her eyes. It's very dark, especially for a story that's actually written for children. But a lot of great children's stories are very dark, and this is no exception. This is like a modern horror version of Alice in Wonderland, except this is much better. It's a more coherent story, and actually has more of a fitting beginning, middle, and end for a story, and feels like a real novel. I I highly recommend it. I've read it several times. It never gets old, and it's a very quick read. And it also has great illustrations by Dave McKeon. So definitely check it out. If you've only seen the Coraline movie, this is actually much better, and it's a lot different. This is actually much more of a, fits like a traditional written fairy tale. Whereas the movie is more of its own story, even though it is a telling of it, but it's like an alternate universe version of Coraline. So definitely check it out. It's a lot darker than you think, and it appeals to all audiences, not just kids. Alright, next up is a book I've talked about before, Collapse of Horses, Brian Evanson. Book of short stories. This dude is amazing. He's definitely a great writer who writes very bizarre, very dark material. He's not well heard of, he's not well known, but he's very good. He writes very powerful stories that are very strange, often very disturbing. This was the first book I read by him, and it made me a fan. And he writes very strange psychological stuff. And I did a whole video. Watch that video. I did a review of it. I also like that he plays around with structure and narrative a lot, but also like he knows how to write very literary stuff that's also very firmly grounded in horror, but also has like elements in weird fiction as well. If you like weird fiction and if you like horror, you should definitely check out A Collapse of Horses. Stories in here are amazing. There's one story in here called A Window that actually feels very much like Murakami, so I imagine he's an influence. Also, side note, his writing feels very much inspired by Raymond Carver, another famous favorite writer of mine, who wrote very mundane stories of average characters. Like, this is like basically if like Raymond Carver was a horror writer. Very good. Definitely check out Brian Evanson. Next up is another book of short stories. This one by Nathan Balligren called North American Lake Monsters. This one is very interesting. The stories in here are very eclectic, although there are a lot of horror stories in here. Some of them are more just kind of touch a little bit on horror, and some of them are more just kind of dramas with horror elements. There's a great story here called Wild Acre about a werewolf attack and its aftermath, and it's actually more just about the aftermath. The great stories about this, the great thing about the stories in here, that's what I was trying to say, are that they're more just dramas with some supernatural elements. They're about interesting, compelling characters that are going through usually very transitional periods in their life. Usually something major happens, and we're reading kind of the aftermath of it. Like, usually something will happen just at the beginning or just after the story starts, or just before. And these stories are just kind of how the characters are metaphorically tackling these issues through the guise of these strange, fantastic elements. These are more kind of probably surrealist or fantasy stories. However, there are dark stuff in here, but they are very good. And Nathan Balligren is another writer who deserves your attention, so check out North American Lake Monsters. Definitely great for October. And yet another book of short stories, Swift to Chase by Laird de Barron. Laird Barron's very great. He writes very strange, bizarre, noir-influenced stories. These feel like if William S. Burroughs and Raymond Chandler collaborated together. They have the noir elements, and they're also all the stories in here are connected in some way. There's characters that go in and out. There's incidents that are talked about from different points of view. Very strange. It almost feels like a very experimental novel, and how all these stories are interconnected. But I did a whole video on this one too, so check that out for a full review of it. But this is definitely great for Halloween, and definitely great for this kind of colder, drearier time of year, when everything's a little darker and everything's a little scarier. So, Swift to Chase, check it out. Another great weird fiction writer. Weird fiction needs a bigger audience. For the love of God, get people in here reading weird fiction. So here you go. Alright, another Neil Gaiman book, The Ocean at the End of the Lane. I did a video on this before, did a full review of it. This one I bring up for October because it kind of feels more like the more witchy, magical end of October. This feels more like more kind of the creepy, witchy, magical, autumnal aspect, as opposed to the scarier aspect. This book is beautiful. Like, it tackles childhood, adulthood, the themes of what makes us, themes of memory, the loss of innocence, the magic of childhood, the magic of discovery. Those are all like beautifully talked about in this book. Gaiman is a master storyteller. I don't give a shit what anyone says. He's one of the best writers in the last 50 years. He's amazing. I read quite a bit of his works, but this is probably my favorite thing he's ever written. I've read it several times. I will read it several more. And just for a quick reference, the plot of it is about this unnamed narrator who's looking back on his childhood when he lived in the country, and he knew a girl there who had all these kind of weird supernatural witchy elements that lived with her, like, I think her mom and her aunt, or it might have been her aunt or her great aunt. And they supposedly came from another country across an ocean, but the ocean is just like a duck pond in their backyard. However, they can also easily make things that are not there different or manipulate reality in little ways. There's a part where, in true fairy tale fashion, a creature comes to stay in the boy's home and manipulates his father, and he has to turn to his new friends to help combat that creature. And like they trap him in like another reality. Like they put her like in a pocket dimension. So it's very strange. It feels kind of like an amalgamation of all these disparate influences. Fairy tales. There's a lot of like Wrinkle in Time in here. There's a lot of kind of like Ray Bradbury. A lot of influence in here. There's a lot of there's some Stephen King influence in here. There's a lot of different things. Like Gaiman just likes to take different things that he likes and puts them all in a stew, and they're all great. And he turns them all into this own original vision. It's really cool to read. Not only that, but this is just a very emotional story. Every time I read this, I cry. I usually don't, like I said, I usually don't react to much fiction, but this hits me really hard. And it's just about the things that kids go through, the pleasant things, the unpleasant things, the good things, the bad things. And just, about a boy's one magical, childhood. Both the good kind of magic and the dark, scary kind of magic. Perfect for October. So, the Ocean at the End of the Lane, Neil Gaiman, definitely worth the read. I will be rereading it. So, oh shit. Oh my god. So, last up, I started with Clive Barker. I'm going to end with Clive Barker. I have the Books of Blood, as I mentioned previously. These are a collection of short stories. This is volumes 1 to 3. These are fantastic horror pieces. Again, they're a little more on the conventional side than what Clive would write later, but they're very, very good. I highly recommend them. And there's some pretty imaginative premises in here as well. There's a story about a guy who's on a night train going out, last train of the night, going to the station. And there's a guy on there who's a maniac who's butchering people, and he's trying to run from this dude. And it's very suspenseful because you don't know, is he going to live? Is he going to die? And that's really especially alarming because most of these stories in here don't have happy endings. They're very dark. The monster wins at the end every single time, for the most part. There's another great story in here. It's like a dark comedy about a guy who lives with a demon. The demon is trying its damnedest, no pun intended, to make him go insane, and the guy's just avoiding it and ignoring it. And it's pissing off the demon. It's great. It's a very dark, comical story. It's the kind of thing Kafka would have thought of. There's great stuff. There's great stories in here. There's one about a troupe of theater actors who are all dead, and they're putting on one last show and killing the living. There's one in here about a parade of monsters that come through town, and a boy who is one of them, even though he looks like a normal boy, and how he's trying to join them. There's a lot of really weird shit going on. They're great. They're all, like I said, they're very dark. This cover photograph is very fitting for the tone. It's very gothic. It's very, very surreal and nightmarish. These are basically little prose nightmares. And the most darkest situations there are. And then there's also some like tenderness here too. There's a story about a guy who dies. He's a ghost, and he comes back to put revenge on the people who had him killed. And he puts on like a literal sheet over his head, and he gets his revenge. But also, there's like you feel the sympathy for him because he's dead, and now he doesn't know what to do, and he can't pass on. And he's a very likable character, and you feel sympathy for him. There's a story in here about a demon creature that inhabits a movie theater and draws in the employees into like fictional worlds and presents like this different faces of like movie actors and stuff to talk to them and manipulate them. It's very good. Man, there's a lot of stories in here. Some of them are better than others. Some of them are not as good, but they're all really worth reading. They're all very good. And there's also a really bizarre bugfuck story in here about like these giants that are composed of like living bodies all mingled up and going through the countryside. It's great. There's some weird shit in here. And it definitely shows the kind of imagination and scope of vision that Clive Barker has. So again, Books of Blood 1 to 3. Please read them. And if you like these, definitely check out his novels. Clive has actually written quite a bit in the fantasy genre as well, with novels such as Weave World and Magica that are fantastic. And I actually like his fantasy writing more than I do his horror writing, even though he's a very good horror writer. And these were his first works published that definitely show his imagination and his talent for writing horror. So there it is. Those are my book recommendations. I appreciate you guys watching this video. You guys are fantastic. And I'm so glad I was able to work out some tech issues I was having to get this video out to you guys, because I wanted to do something to kind of celebrate October, and I will probably most likely be doing some more videos this month, depending on how things go. Because truth is, I'm getting ready to move. I'm actually in the midst of doing that right now. Still got a lot of stuff I got to do. So I'm trying to work on videos in between doing major stuff relating to that. And once I get established elsewhere, I'll go back to doing YouTube videos. But for now, while I am able, I will keep doing these YouTube videos here, where I'm living right now. So anyways, thanks for watching. I appreciate it. If you liked this video, I do other videos about books. Mostly books. I do other videos too about other things, but mostly books. I'm a writer. I've recently did a video where I read something I wrote, so I'm going to start doing more of those, just reading pieces I've written. And so this channel, if you're new to it, is very book themed, very writerly themed. And I hope you liked this recommendations video. I've done several book review videos in the past. You can check those out, and if you like it, subscribe. And if you don't, I'm sorry I wasted your time. I'm also sorry if you don't like any of the books I recommended in this video, but these are my opinions, and so everyone has one. So you don't have to like my recommendations, but you don't have to watch my videos either. So that said, I appreciate the ones who do watch these, all 2 people out there who watch these things regularly. I will see you guys in the next one.